Welcome, everyone. Before we get started here today, I want to acknowledge something. I want to acknowledge the loss that our community experienced this past weekend. I want to acknowledge Valeria and Olivia. We are holding this talk as planned in spite of recent circumstances because some of us, including myself, feel better with grief if we have some sense of normalcy. Others of us may deal with grief by focusing on good things. I believe that the talk we have for you today is an unabashedly good thing. So with that, I'll say that I'm thrilled today to welcome Adam Auerbach back to the Kellogg Institute. Professor Auerbach was a Kellogg Fellow shortly after finishing his PhD and spent his time on campus converting his dissertation into the book he will present to us today. In some ways, this represents a project coming full circle. That's one of the reasons why it's an unabashedly good thing. As some of you know, and others will see, Professor Auerbach's research focuses on local governance, urban politics, and the political economy of development, with a regional focus on South Asia and, of course, India in particular. His research appears in all of the most notable development and political science journals, the AJPS, the APSR, Contemporary South Asia, Journal of Politics, Perspectives on Politics, Studies in Comparative International Development, and World Politics. Collect them all, folks. Today, Professor Auerbach will present to us his book, Demanding Development, The Politics of Public Goods Provision in India's Urban Slums. It is based upon an award-winning dissertation, and its publication is one of the better things to happen in 2020. Please join me in welcoming Adam Auerbach back to the Kellogg Institute.
Susan, thank you so much for the really kind introduction. And thank you all so much for joining this evening. Please let me start just by expressing how excited I am to be able to talk about my new book at the Kellogg Institute. My year as a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute was just an absolutely wonderful one. And as Susan had mentioned, it really centered on making that transition from dissertation to book manuscript. I was so lucky to be surrounded that year by the incredible faculty and students and other fellows at the Kellogg Institutes. And so, yeah, it's so wonderful to really, as Susan said, come full circle and, being able to present on the final version of the book here with you all. The book's title is Demanding Development, The Politics of Public Goods Provision in India's Urban Slums, which was published earlier this year by Cambridge University Press. It's based on over 2 years of qualitative fieldwork and survey research that I've done in 2 North Indian cities, Jaipur, Rajasthan, and Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh. I prepared about 45-50 minutes of a presentation accompanied by slides. I really look forward to any and all questions and getting into a discussion about the book and its findings. So my book really centers on a puzzle that emerges from India's vast population of slum settlements. And that is that India's urban slums exhibit really dramatic variation in their levels of basic infrastructural developments and access to public services. I'm talking about things here like paved roads, piped water, sewers, streetlights, trash removal, drainage. I find this variation across India's slum settlements to be especially puzzling because despite they share these broad vulnerabilities stemming from weak or absent formal property rights. Most people, particularly in the type of slum settlement that I study, and I'll define in a moment, squatter settlements, most residents don't have a land title. They face the threat of eviction. We also know that these are areas with really entrenched forms of patronage politics, asymmetrical relationships between city politicians and the urban poor. And as a large literature has established, this state is often very dismissive to the poor in India, and capricious in its responsiveness to the claims from the urban poor. Yet, despite these broadly shared sort of vulnerabilities, settlements have really diverged in their level of infrastructural development and access to basic public goods and services. So the question that frames the book is, why are some vulnerable communities able to mobilize, claim, and secure developments from the state while others fail? And these divergences, I think, are sort of nicely captured in these 2 photographs at the bottom of the slide here. Both of these settlements emerged at the same time in 1980, 1981. As you see in the settlement on the left there, there are absolutely no paved roads. There's no drainage. Every morning residents need to come and sort of dig out these sort of handmade channels here. There's no piped water. There's only sort of this sole hand pump for a settlement of over 1,000 people. This other settlement on the right here, again, that emerged at the exact same time. Residents have roughly the same per capita income as in the first slide, but it's managed to get many infrastructural goods and access to services. If you can see, the roads are paved. There's a piped water line coming into the settlements. They have actual formalized electricity connections. These little manholes show that there's sewer connections, just to sort of illustrate the kind of divergences that I would see in the field. And just for a moment, if I can say, I was first motivated to ask this question during graduate school when I was doing a summer internship at the National Institute for Urban Affairs in Delhi. And I was really lucky to be part of this team of researchers at NIUA who were getting back this survey data from cities throughout India on JNNURM, the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, which was really, at that time, an unprecedentedly large in terms of the finances urban development project in India. And it really struck me by looking at the survey data that, not only across cities, but within cities and even within small municipal wards, sort of the smallest unit of elected representation in these in cities, that these settlements that had emerged at the same time were so uneven in their access to goods and services. And so that, this really sort of motivated my initial interest in this project and launched me into these several years of field work and what ultimately culminated in my book. So to further motivate this variation that I'm discussing and more concretely, here is a table of descriptive statistics from the survey that I conducted across 111 slum settlements in these two North Indian cities, Bhopal and Jaipur. And I look at 6 different outcome variables: paved road coverage, household sewer connections, streetlights per capita, household access to piped water, municipal trash removal, government medical camps. And as you'll see when you look down the mean column and the standard deviation column, there's really wide variation in access to these goods and services. And it's not immediately readable from the minimum, min and max columns there, but some settlements have absolutely all of these goods and services to the point where they almost cease to look like slum settlements anymore. Others are just as squalid as they were 20, 30, 40 years ago and have absolutely none of these goods and services. So again, what generates this variation? So before proceeding, I'd like to put the book in context, define the type of settlements under study, and introduce these 2 cities in which I did most of my field work. So India's last census, which was conducted in 2011, India conducts a census every 10 years. So, of course, the next one is coming up very soon. And the past one is actually quite dated now, but going back to that most recent census, it was estimated that 65 million people live in India's urban slums. And UN Habitat and several other organizations estimate this number to be well above 100 million people. But even if we take this lower estimate of 65 million, we're talking about a really large chunk of humanity here, a number that exceeds the entire population of countries like Colombia or Italy or South Africa, just living in slum settlements within India's cities. And this makes up a really substantial portion of what's estimated to be over 850 million people worldwide that reside in these informal urban settlements. In my book, I focus on a specific type of slum settlements, and that is squatter settlements. Drawing on earlier literature on urban informality in India, many scholars have argued that it's really important to delineate the type of urban poverty pocket under study. This term slum is oftentimes given to neighborhoods that are quite diverse in their origins and their social integration in the city. And so scholars, and myself included, argue that it's important to define the specific type of settlement that you're studying. That this term slum is oftentimes so amorphous that it's including many different types of urban poverty pockets. So my focus is really on squatter settlements. So what is a squatter settlement? These are neighborhoods in India's cities that are constructed by residents themselves in a very decentralized, haphazard manner. So imagine a greenfield site, in the middle of a city, in the periphery of a city where there's, literally nothing there. Squatters will come onto the land, set up their jugis, which is the Hindi word for shanty. These are the classic origins of squatter settlements. They initially, and most of them continue to lack any type of formal property rights. Squatters are residing on government lands or private lands owned by other individuals. And so they face this looming threat of eviction. Also, because it's greenfield sites, all squatter settlements, this is important, this will be important analytically in my argument, they all are uniformly lacking in access to services and infrastructure initially. Whatever you see in terms of infrastructure or services provided is something that came much afterwards, based on political transactions with politicians. Another defining feature of squatter settlements in India and elsewhere is that these settlements are often established on environmentally sensitive lands in the city. So you'll find them along riverbeds, prone to flooding. You'll find them along mountainsides, prone to rock slides, next to railroad tracks, trash dumps, factories, areas of the city that are otherwise undesirable for human habitation. Squatters will settle in these areas largely deliberately because there are fewer competing interests over that land. And so it slightly reduces the threat of eviction, just simply because there aren't these other competing interests for that land. So to show you some pictures, here's one of the settlements that I spent several months in eastern Jaipur during its very early few months in the late 1970s. You'll see migrant squatters have arrived on the land. They've set up their shanties. This is actually a 3-kilometer long sand dune in eastern Jaipur, and they've settled on this land. It's government-owned land, and they're building these middle-class neighborhoods in the eastern part of Jaipur. Another image of these migrant construction workers who end up settling in the area, overlooking these neighborhoods that they're building. So yeah, I go in 30 or 40 years later. This settlement now houses 25,000 people. It has access to some goods and services, certainly more than it did in those initial pictures, but residents still lack property rights. Their houses are still, the Hindi word would be kacha, or makeshift. Because why invest more in the construction of one's household if you can be evicted at any time? So just to show you some images, classic images of squatter settlements from my field work. If you zoom out even further, this is just one area of the city of Bhopal, the capital city of the state of Madhya Pradesh. Each of those purple polygons is just one squatter settlement. And this was an important step in my survey design that I'd be happy to talk about more afterward in terms of the use of satellite images. But just to sort of show the spatial distribution of these settlements are really throughout the city. And when you go to each or any one of these purple polygon, these settlements, they have their own names. People in that area of the city will immediately point you out to them. If you're in what's one area of the city and you say, where is Sanjay Nagar Kachi Basti? Kachi Basti means slum settlement. People know exactly what you're talking about. They'll point you to that settlement. Each settlement will have its own unique ethnic groups in terms of caste, in terms of the region of origin of the migrants settling, in terms of the religion of the neighborhood, of the residents of the neighborhood. And each will have its own relationships with politicians in the area. So in many ways, when you go into these settlements, they're their own sort of social and political ecosystems in and of themselves. Residents identify with their settlements. To introduce the two cities that I'll be discussing further in the presentation, so I did my fieldwork almost entirely in these two cities of Bhopal and Jaipur. And these are just two of what is estimated to be over 50 cities in India that have over 1 million people within them, as per the 2011 census. Jaipur has a population of about 3 million people, and Bhopal about 2 million people. And I chose them as sort of an appropriate pairing of cities in which to conduct my fieldwork for several reasons, that they share a lot of commonalities. They're both capitals of their respective states of Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. Historically, they were both princely states during the colonial period. So they were sort of indirectly colonized by the British, but remained princely states. In both of the cities, the two primary parties in competition are the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and the Indian National Congress. They're also both, really firmly situated in the Hindi-speaking belt of North India that is has comparatively lower human development indicators than much of the rest of India. So for these many reasons, these became sort of an appropriate set of cities in which for me to conduct my field work. And I'd be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A as well, but I was purposely drawn to cities that were not India's mega cities, places like Delhi or Mumbai or Kolkata or Bangalore. And that's because most people living in slum settlements in India do not live in the mega cities of the country. Much of the research and certainly much of the journalistic work on slum settlements in India, even during the pandemic, focuses not only on places like Mumbai, but specific settlements within Mumbai, places like Dharavi, for those of you that are familiar, oftentimes referred to as Asia's biggest slum, that has over 1 million people in it. Settlements like that are really a statistical outlier, right? Most residents of India's slums do not live in the mega cities and do not live in these enormous settlements. They live in cities like Bhopal or Jaipur, or what is an even larger constellation of smaller cities and towns spread throughout the country. So just to give you a sense of why I focused on these two cities over others. Okay, I'd like to turn now to my theoretical framework that was very much inductively built through ethnographic fieldwork and then tested more deductively through my survey work. So my book focuses on an absolutely pervasive set of political actors in India's slum settlements, and that is the Basti Neta, or slum leader. So just to introduce these actors to you that really do sit at the center of my theoretical framework. India's slum leaders are completely informal non-state actors. They are not formally elected. They do not possess a formal position within the bureaucracy. They are really everyday residents of the community, and they emerged from within the rank and file sort of everyday residents in their settlements to take on this position of the Basti Neta. Now having sort of interviewed and surveyed several hundred of these actors, never once have I come across one where he or she said, I moved to this city and I wanted to become a slum leader. That was sort of the reason why I migrated to the city. They migrated to the city like any other resident in the community, but because of certain features and characteristics of themselves, other residents of the community are attracted to them, to turn to them to help solve problems in the neighborhood. So to point out some of those characteristics, and drawing on some of the work that I've done with one of my co-authors, Tarak Tachel, slum leaders tend to be better educated than the average residents. They tend to almost all be literate and have sort of more formal years of schooling. This, of course, is really important because they need to be able to navigate government institutions to make claims on the states for basic infrastructure and to fight eviction. They also are more likely to hold, very modest but still important jobs in the municipality, even things like a municipal street sweeper or a chokidar, a municipal guard. Again, very modest municipal jobs, but it provides this linkage to the bureaucracy within the city. There are also features of these actors that are more difficult to measure, but are still really important. They're extremely charismatic as leaders. And they're also quite bold. They don't back down in front of officials. And so there are residents in neighborhoods that possess these qualities and end up taking on the mantle of the slum leader over time. India's slum leaders are absolutely pervasive. In only 3 of the 111 settlements in my sample were there not any resident identified slum leaders. So in the vast majority of settlements, there were not only slum leaders, but usually multiple slum leaders competing with one another for a following of residents in the community. So you can essentially assume that if you walk into a community and you say, is Basti mein aapka neta kahan rehte hai? In this community, where does your informal leader live? People know exactly who you're talking about. Again, and there's usually multiple slum leaders operating within the settlements. Within the political science literature, these actors really conform to this type of political actor called a political broker. That they exist in this intermediary space between residents and the state, where for residents, they take local problems and help residents make demands on the state. And particularly around elections, but also in between elections, political elites, politicians will lean on slum leaders to mobilize residents in the community behind them. So again, these actors really represent sort of classic political brokers. So of specific focus in my book are a set of slum leaders who are part of party network organizations, thus becoming party workers. They have a pad, the Hindi word for a position within the party hierarchy. And this connects them to the highest levels of political organization in the city and oftentimes in the state. As I mentioned, in both Jaipur and Bhopal and the larger states in which they're embedded, the two main political parties in competition are the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and the INC, the Indian National Congress. And these two parties are organized in a very similar pyramidal way in the two cities. That's the smallest scale of organization. There will be a booth committee of party workers. Larger than that is the settlements, then a ward, a block at the city level. So there are these defined party hierarchies and networks in which these slum leaders with party positions are embedded within the network hierarchy. And they're very similar to earlier work on the Democratic Party machine, for instance, in Gilded Age American cities. Thinking about Tammany Hall in places like New York City. It's very much a similar machine style politics. And there's really no ambiguity around these actors when you walk into a settlement. So just to show you some images that would be very common in my field work, many party workers in slum settlements will have these placards, with their name, with their position. So this one individual is the Sachiv, or secretary of the BJP at the ward level. They have their party symbol. In other settlements, there'll be these large boards listing the names of all the party workers in their respective positions. This clearly sort of signals that, especially in this left-hand side picture, this is an individual with these upward partisan connections to political elites, and they can be turned to for problem solving in the settlements. So to give you a more, even more concrete picture of these actors, here is one party worker in in Jaipur, who lives not far from the main train station in Jaipur. I'll refer to him as Qureshi Bai. I'm of course changing his name. Qureshi Bai moved to the settlements like every other resident about 35 years ago. He lives in the settlement with his family. He owns a kirana dukan, which means general store. So you can usually find him in his general store selling, lentils and rice and soap, basic provisions. But his main vocation and what he's most known for in the neighborhood is being a party worker. So what you see in this picture is, an everyday resident coming to Qureshi Bai, asking for help to get a ration card. So that he and his family can get access to subsidized food and fuel. So Qureshi Bai on an everyday basis is helping residents get access to these cards or an electricity connection or a water connection, or to help pave a road or ask for more sort of collective goods like sewer lines or a school for the neighborhood. During elections then, he is the ward upadhyaksh, the ward vice president of the Congress Party. And so he takes all of that goodwill and problem solving that he does on a daily basis and then turns to residents to encourage them to support the Congress Party, his political party, during elections. So just an illustration of one of just the several hundred of these actors that I discuss in the book. So I argue in the book that variation in public goods provision across these neighborhoods is in large part driven by the uneven spread of these party workers, people like Qureshi Bai. So across the 111 slum settlements in my sample, I conducted a census of all of the party workers across these 111 settlements. And there are in total 663 party workers, slum leaders with positions in the party organizations. But their distribution across neighborhoods was highly variable. There's really striking variation in the presence of party workers, in their density, or their simple numbers per capita, and in their partisan distribution. So the average settlement in my sample has about 2 party workers per 200 households, with a standard deviation of about 1.5 party workers. In 20 settlements, though, there are no party workers whatsoever. There's no one in the settlement that has that sort of upward connectivity to parties to help petition the states to advance the material interests of residents. In other settlements, there are upwards of 6 party workers per 200 households. So in these sort of settlements, you can hardly go down an alleyway without bumping into a party worker. The settlement is completely flush with these actors. So not only is there variation in the presence and density of these actors, but there's also variation in the partisan balance of them. So some settlements have only BJP workers, some have only Congress workers, and most are somewhere in between in terms of their partisan distribution of the party workers within them. So just to graphically illustrate this, 2 party workers per 200 households, might not immediately appear to be sort of a large number. But remember, these are extremely densely populated settlements with houses that typically have 1 or 2 rooms. Having 2 party workers in that tiny little area of the settlements of this cluster of 200 households, means that there are 2 people, quite literally down the streets that have these ties with political elites to help solve problems in that area. This bottom image, graphically representing what is the sort of closer to the maximum value of party workers per capita. So 6 party workers per 200 households. Now there's an additional 4 people in that area doing problem solving and, what I'll argue in a moment, competing with one another for a following of residents in the community that compels them to be active problem solvers or risk losing their following within the community. So just to restate the central argument of the book, slum settlements with dense party worker networks are better positioned to mobilize, demand, and secure development from the state than those settlements in which these party networks are really thin or totally absent. And I argue in the book that this relationship between the density of these party worker networks and outcomes in community development work through 3 distinct mechanisms, each of which I observed during the ethnographic portion of my fieldwork, and then incorporated into my survey work to explicitly test. So I'd like to march through each one of these mechanisms that undergird the theoretical framework of the book. The first mechanism is informal accountability through competition among party workers for a following. So what I argue and find in the book is that settlements with dense party worker networks, in these sort of settlements, workers must really actively compete with one another for a following of residents. And this really takes place on an everyday basis. Imagining sort of that image of Mr. Qureshi helping people on a day-to-day sort of quotidian basis. The larger your following is as a party worker, the more goodies that you get as a party worker. So the more people that follow you, the more people that turn to you to get help with getting access to things like ration cards or electricity connections or water connections or a new paved road for your streets. Party workers ask for fees to do these sorts of activities. I initially assumed that this would be understood in the communities as a form of brashtrachar or corruption, the Hindi word for corruption. But when you actually talk to the party workers themselves, they'll sort of say, I just spent the entire afternoon down at the district collector's office to help this person get this ration card or this BPL card. Why should I not be compensated for that? So slum leaders or party workers that are really popular, that have a large following within their community, there's simply more people turning to them on an everyday basis to do all of these acts of mediation to help people navigate the state. And they're getting paid to do all of these things. So this is just one incentive to make sure that you're popular and you have a large following. Popular party workers also receive handsome sums from parties during elections to do everyday sort of door-to-door canvassing, mobilizational activities, getting residents to go out and join in rallies. In many cases, and I document in the book, they get paid the equivalent of several months of income within their neighborhood just to do activities that sometimes only span several days. So showing that you're popular to a party can also be very, very lucrative as a party worker. But you have to show, again, that you have this large following within the settlements. Also, party workers have their own political aspirations. They're not sort of satisfied in just being a slum leader and a party worker forever. Many of them articulate aspirations to climb up within the party hierarchy and maybe even someday get a party ticket to fight in a municipal election under their party label. But for all of these things, again, you need to be popular and have a large following. And in a context with other party workers competing for that same base of residents, it compels party workers to be really active claim makers, to be active problem solvers in their settlements. Because if they fail to solve problems for residents, or they're transgressing on residents or are seen really not to be doing much of anything, residents are simply going to vote with their feet and turn to other slum leaders and party workers to get help within the community. And so you really have to stay on your toes as a party worker within a slum settlement and constantly demonstrate that you're able to get things done for people. So just to illustrate that with one of the quotes from the book, an interview with a party worker in a Jaipur slum settlements. This party worker told me, yes, there's an example of one leader who people stopped following after I came to the slum because I knew more than him. I knew everything about the system, whether you go to the Public Health and Engineering Department, the Jaipur Municipal Corporation, the Electricity Board, the Development Authority, or the Collectorate. I knew how to solve all these problems, hence that leader became less popular. And dozens of these interviews sort of produced this or highlighted this mechanism of the most active and best problem solvers in the community. Those party workers were the ones that really sort of amassed the biggest following and thus got to consume and get all of these fees and services and patronage because of that popularity. I also outline in the book that there's a degree of accountability that comes from above within party worker networks. And that are political elites outside of the slum settlements. They keep a really careful eye on their local party workers, that they see these party workers as the face of the party within slum settlements. And politicians in India's cities use the English term vote bank to describe slum settlements in the city, that these are really electorally crucial neighborhoods in the city where turnout is much higher than it is in middle-class neighborhoods in wealthy areas. And so politicians in India's cities know that much of their electoral prospects will hinge on the support that they can build within slum settlements. And so if a local party worker with the same party label as your own is going around engaging in dadagiri, the Hindi word for sort of forceful behavior or gang activities, not helping residents, not really doing anything, that also hurts your reputation and your electoral prospects. And so I outline in the book handfuls of examples of party workers' promotions being stalled, or even in some extreme circumstances being kicked out of the party because of all the complaints of everyday residents to the political elites above them that party worker is simply not doing anything. So to illustrate this with a few quotes, this first interview is with the state Adhyaksh, or president of the BJP in the state of Madhya Pradesh. So he says, in a slum, I will have a pramukh, or chief, who will watch the other party workers. Every worker monitors every other worker. And so this is how we get to know what's going on from the top to the bottom. If someone is doing wrong things, we try to teach them. If that doesn't work, we'll kick them out. The second quote is through the eyes of a party worker in a slum settlement in Jaipur. Parties watch local workers. Now, how do they do this? By seeing our work. If the party gave me a task to complete and I'm unable to do it, they get to know I'm not a good worker. Or if the party didn't give me a task, but I should have done it anyway on my own, but couldn't, the party will think I'm not a good worker, so they kick that person out and appoint someone else. Our party makes a team that goes around and checks on workers. Okay, so a second mechanism connecting the density of party worker networks to outcomes in local developments has to do with the organizational capacity for protest and other contentious forms of claim making. That settlements with dense party worker networks are very well positioned to internally organize residents within the community and get them out onto the streets to engage in protest much like the picture at the bottom of the slide. Not only are they more capable of organizing residents for protests to advance the material needs and security of the neighborhood, but they're able to draw on the larger party organizations in the city to draw attention to problems within the settlement. So it was very common that party worker networks would mobilize residents, but they would also call on important politicians in the city of their party to come with them in the protests to amplify their voice and give greater attention to their grievances. Whereas in those neighborhoods without any party worker networks, or ones that are very, very thin, they simply just didn't demonstrate this sort of mobilizational capacity for protest. So this picture on the bottom, again, really sort of exemplifies this. This is the Jugi Jopri Prakosht, or slum cell of the Congress Party in Bhopal. Again, people coming from one settlement, but this larger event organized by the party in the city through the networks going down into the individual settlement. So one newspaper clipping that I think nicely illustrates this. Under the leadership of the former minister and BJP leader, Kalicharan Saraf, Jawahar Nagar slum dwellers organized a traffic jam at Jawahar Nagar bypass to protest about various issues. They demanded repairing the damaged roads, discontinuation of heavy vehicle movement on the road, and improved development work. The police officers tried to appease the BJP leaders who were organizing the traffic jam, but the hundreds of people who were jamming the traffic opened the roads only after the meeting was over. So this was a newspaper clipping of, from one of my case study settlements that had these really dense party worker networks, and were able to hold these, really boisterous, energetic protests at the state capitol building, the Vidhan Sabha, and got all these important sort of political actors involved in the protests. This was something that was replicated across many of my qualitative case studies in those areas with these dense party worker networks. The third and final mechanism connecting the density of party worker networks and outcomes in local development is political connectivity. That residents in settlements with dense party worker networks, they have multiple of these party workers, oftentimes again on the same road, but within the same settlements, that have these intimate connections with political elites. And for those of you that have done fieldwork in India, and I suspect these sort of scenes are reproduced elsewhere in the world, when you meet a ward councillor or a member of the legislative assembly or a member of parliament, they're oftentimes surrounded by small groups of their party workers who just sort of hang out every day. They're gossiping, they're doing small sort of works and projects for the politician. So this sort of connectivity between the party workers in slum settlements and political elites is something that's fostered on a face-to-face basis, really in an everyday sort of way. And so that they can turn this face-to-face connectivity into an important tie to get leverage over the bureaucracy to deliver goods and services to the community. Connectivity also manifests itself through party stationery. One of the most fascinating sources of data that I'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes is that, much to my surprise, India's slum leaders are obsessive with archiving all of the petitions that they send to politicians or officials, all of their community meeting notes, various political ephemera. And so you can see, this is just one of hundreds of examples of these, that in those neighborhoods with party workers, the party workers are given very formal party stationery with the MLA or their political patron's name on it. And many interviews that I point to in the book, a bureaucrat will say, if I get a petition like this one on the right, I know that if I don't really respond to it in somewhat of a timely fashion, I'm inviting protest. I'm inviting the wrath of the political patron of this community. Whereas in those settlements that don't have party worker networks or are very thin in terms of their party worker networks, you oftentimes see petitions like this, just sort of handwritten on blank paper. This is much more likely to get lost in sort of the bureaucratic shuffle. And so these everyday forms of connectivity, and as manifest through the actual physical materials that are used as vehicles to petition the states, those settlements with dense party worker networks are just better positioned to claim and secure development. So 2 quotes just to illustrate the importance of connectivity. This is from an everyday resident in one slum settlement in Jaipur. The public can't solve these problems themselves. That's why we're dependent on the slum leaders. It's like a chain link. We're connected to the slum leader, who's connected to a bigger leader, who's connected to an even bigger leader. When we complain to the slum leaders, they complain to officials on our behalf. That's how our work gets done. And the second quote from a slum leader in Bhopal: "It's necessary to have good connections with the party. That's how development happens. When you have good connections with the party, you can tell them, we have an electricity problem. You can write to your party or MLA for development. Then the MLA will write a letter on his letterhead to the electricity department. Our problems then get resolved." So this was a repeated theme in my qualitative fieldwork, the importance of this connectivity. Okay. So I'd like now to turn to the research design of the book. So, going now all the way back to graduate school, the first and I think most important foundation of my project rested on 15 continuous months of ethnographic fieldwork in 4 case study slum settlements in Jaipur and 4 case study settlements in Bhopal. And I approached these case study settlements in a very inductive way that, we have very little empirical, understandings, descriptive understandings of how people in these communities organize amongst themselves, organize to defend themselves from eviction, to claim public services. How does informal leadership form in these communities over time? And so I wanted to allocate this first section of my project to just doing really intensive everyday ethnography, to be able to really understand how politics operates in these communities. And much of those case study was historically bent. That squatter settlements, remember the particular type of slum settlement under study, the average age of these settlements is about 35 years. And so many residents in the communities, they were the initial squatters when the community first emerged. And so this granted me really unique analytical leverage in being able to trace, from point A, when people first arrived on the land and created the squatter settlements, oftentimes in the mid 1970s, early 1980s, to point B when I go in and do my field work. Over that period of time, how did leadership form? How were connections with political parties fostered? How are claims articulated and made on the states? And through comparison across the case studies, with this historical process tracing, trying to move towards a theory of why some settlements are better positioned to secure these goods and services and not others. So of course, this also involved hundreds of interviews with local politicians, ward councilors, MLAs, bureaucrats. But as I mentioned a little bit before, especially the historical process tracing really hinged on a conversation between my oral historical data and what ultimately ended up being thousands of these paper petitions and these community meeting notes that slum leaders kept. And if you're interested, I have a paper in Studies in International Comparative Development on the collection of these papers and how to sort of form historical narratives for informal urban settlements that often don't have historical materials in formal archives. That to recreate the microhistories of these communities, we oftentimes have to turn to these sort of informal documents that, again, were totally unanticipated prior to my fieldwork, but ended up being really essential in understanding, at any given point in time. And these documents would very often go back to the origins of the community. Who were leaders at particular points in time? What were the problems that residents faced? Who were the politicians that they were writing petitions to? And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but many of these neighborhoods also have something that were referred to as vikas samitis or development councils. And so many of these leaders also kept really extensive meeting notes from this sort of associational life of the community itself. So these all serve to be really important qualitative data points alongside oral histories to reconstruct the history of these small micro neighborhoods to understand these divergences in development and political organization. To give you a sense of some of these petitions that I collected, here's one petition from a settlement in Jaipur that is really politically marginalized. No party workers and also very low levels of basic public infrastructure and services. So this one petition says, "We poor Gonds and Singhiwals." Gonds and Singhiwals, these are 2 caste groups in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, and many other poor people. We have to tolerate heat, cold, rain, and many other problems. We sell herbs, drive rickshaws, make swings, play drums, make wooden trays. We've been staying here for the past 30 to 35 years. We, here for so many years, request the government for help. But we do not get any attention, have been to offices many times, and as a result, it has all become a headache. Therefore, we request that Chhattisgarh Nagari should be rehabilitated, and wherever that is, we should get land titles. We poor people shall always be obliged. So when you read, hundreds of these petitions spanning several decades in the community, it just reinforces the intensive desperation and political marginalization that residents in that community face. But another example from a settlement that has very dense party worker networks and is very well politically organized, showing something quite different, with really close ties to local politicians. Today, a meeting will be held with the entire group of workers. Ward members of the BJP will lead the meeting and the agenda will concern development work. A team will be formed and the ward councilor will play the leading role in the group. So not only does this settlement not face that kind of political marginalization as the one before it, but they actively invite and actually get the responsiveness of local politicians to join in on their meetings. And not coincidentally, that settlement has secured much higher levels of infrastructural development and public services than the first settlement. So just to sort of illustrate the ways that I use these materials in the book. One second, the automatic light in my office just turned off. There we go. All right, thank you. Okay, so after finishing this, my ethnographic fieldwork and these case studies and really getting a sense of, okay, now I feel like I have this inductively built theoretical framework, but I of course want to test that framework outside of the cases I used to build it. So the next two empirical chapters of the book really heavily rely on survey work that I did across these 111 settlements, involving surveys of just over 2,500 people across those settlements. And yeah, happy to talk more in the Q&A about the survey design, but it very largely leans on the use of high resolution satellite imagery and the random selection of rooftops, and then using sort of technology on smartphones to send the enumerators to those specific households. As you can imagine, these settlements have very little reliable information on them otherwise. There's not sort of a magical list of residents that you can do a simple random sample with. And so I was compelled to think through other ways of trying to derive a representative sample of residents in the communities. Okay, so to turn to some of that quantitative work, and just as a reminder, there are two really key explanatory variables that I examine quantitatively in the book. The first is this variable of party worker density, which is, again, is very simply the number of party workers per 1,000 people in the settlements. And then there's this measure of party representational balance. And this measure is bound between 0 and 1. It's a continuous variable between 0 and 1, where a score of 0 means that all of the party workers are from one party. A score of 1 would represent a settlement in which it's a perfect 50-50 split between the Congress Party and BJP. And something in between is in between either complete homogeneity of party workers and this perfect 50-50 split. So it measures that party representational balance concept that I discussed earlier. In terms of the outcome variables, I examined the percentage of roads that are paved in the settlements, the number of streetlights per 1,000 people, the percentage of residents that have household access to sewer connections, the percentage of residents that have household access to piped water, the percentage of residents that acknowledge that the government held a sarkari chikitsa camp, which means sort of a government medical camp, which is a really important sort of frontline service delivery in terms of healthcare in these communities. And then finally, the percentage of residents that acknowledge that the municipality sends sweepers to come and remove solid waste from the community. In terms of the other right-hand side variables, of course, there's a large multidisciplinary literature on community development. And I wanted to, of course, give a fair shake at some of these other alternative explanations to see how they stack up next to the theoretical framework that I derived from my qualitative work. So I look at the ethnic fractionalization of the communities. For those of you in political economy, you've probably read, there's a large literature in political economy, particularly focused on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, that posits a negative relationship between ethnic diversity and community development and cooperation. I measure ethnic fractionalization in terms of jati, subcaste, religion, predominantly Hindus and Muslims, and then the region of origin, where people migrated from. India is incredibly regionally diverse, with many of those regions being linguistically distinct and culturally distinct. And so you get migrants coming from different states in India, and a new emergent social identity that's really important in many of India's cities is one's regional identity, next to their jati and their religion. Social capital, the amount of trust and cooperation in the community, levels of electoral competition at the ward and state level, and political fragmentation among residents. I also include in the models, a number of control variables around the age of the settlements, the population of the settlements, whether or not they're notified. So some settlements are officially acknowledged by the government. And when you're actually enumerated and listed as a slum settlement in India's cities, you're granted some degree of protection from unannounced eviction. Other settlements are not acknowledged by the states, and so they're even more vulnerable to eviction. And I'm happy to talk more about this too in the Q&A. I mean, some settlements will go as far. One of my case study communities, they literally lit their houses on fire to get the fire department to come to the settlements, to force the government to acknowledge that they actually exist and to get onto these lists. So it's an important classification that I also control for. The average monthly household income of residents, the average education of residents, and the percentage of residents that actually have a land title to their house, which is very, very low. So for in the interest of time, I'm happy in the Q&A to actually go through the statistical tables. But just to give you a bottom line sense of the econometric analysis that I present in the book, I find substantial statistical evidence that denser networks of party workers are, in fact, associated with higher levels of public goods provision. That there's a positive association between party network density and paved road coverage, streetlight coverage, trash collection, and the provision of medical camps. There's not a relationship, interestingly, between party network density and sewer and pipe water connections. And what I argue in the book is that these two services are extremely dependent on the networked infrastructure. That if you're in a slum settlement in an area of the city where there is not piped water or sewer lines in the adjacent neighborhoods around you, it doesn't matter how well politically organized you are, it's very difficult to get those things. And so there's a geography to many of these goods or services in terms of their physical networked infrastructure that play a role in the ability of these settlements to get these things. So interestingly, again, even settlements that are very well politically connected and organized still have to overcome sort of substantial infrastructural hurdles to be able to get access to piped water and sewer connections, which is why many settlements have to rely on very intermittent forms of water delivery from trucks, from tube wells or bore wells that are quickly drying up, especially in Rajasthan. And many settlements simply don't have any sewers or bathrooms. And so people are forced to go to the bathroom in the open, typically in some area adjacent to the settlement. Just to quickly note, there's that other variable, party representational balance. In the book, I find some limited suggestive evidence that party representational balance, the more that there's a balance in the partisanship between the BJP and the Congress among party workers, it has a slight attenuating conditional influence. So the more there is balance between BJP and Congress workers, it actually drags down some of the positive effect of having dense party worker networks. And what I argue in the book is that there's lots of interesting cross-cutting mechanisms at play when we're talking about partisan competition among slum leaders in a settlement. In one instance, we can imagine, and I provide evidence for, that this could intensify competition within the settlements and lead party workers to be even more active claim makers. However, in my ethnographic fieldwork, I found many instances of partisan divisions among slum leaders undercutting developments, that competing partisan networks would purposefully undermine the mobilizational efforts of the other party, because they were worried that, if the party workers of the other party mobilize everybody and they get this thing, it's going to make them popular and that's going to help their party. So that's undermined them in terms of rumors, and sometimes this would manifest itself in terms of violence. Pelting the other group with stones, breaking signs, slowing down some of the collective action trying to be mobilized by the other group. So lots of cross-cutting mechanisms within this concept of a party representational balance. So just quickly in these last remaining minutes, of course, if party worker networks are important to community development, that of course begs the question, where do these party networks come from? And why do they vary across settlements in the first place? So what I argue and show in the last empirical chapter of the book is that variation in party network density is really driven by two primary factors. The first is settlement population. That in larger slum settlements, there are top-down incentives for parties to allocate these party positions that are actually very scarce and limited. There are tens of thousands of slum leaders or other people in India cities that would want one of these positions in a political party, but they're very limited in number within each one of the committees. And so parties steer these limited positions to disproportionately to slum leaders in larger settlements because they assume that slum leaders in those larger settlements will be able to deliver a larger mass of voters. There's also bottom-up incentives in large settlements for slum leaders to go into, for residents to go into slum leadership. If you're a resident in a really large populous slum, there's simply a bigger vote bank that you can aspire to lead and capture those everyday rents and patronage from. So you see this sort of, more boisterous clattering of residents to enter into the world of slum leadership and to fight for party positions in larger settlements. And what I do in the book, in addition to showing this association quantitatively, I qualitatively examine, what it then in turn shapes the population of settlements. And what I argue in the book is that settlement population is largely driven by idiosyncratic features of the local urban space around the settlements. And so the hope of this being that I pin this part of the theoretical framework on a largely exogenous foundation. So to give you an example of this, here's a slum settlement in northern Jaipur named Ganeshpuri. This is when the slum settlement started emerging in 2003. You can see squatters have come in. You can see a couple little households here. This is a pre-existing middle-class neighborhood. This is a temple ground that nobody would, set up their homes. And this is a mountain in the north, and these are sand dunes in the east. So this is really the maximum area with which the settlements could expand because of these sort of idiosyncratic features of this area of the city. So 2005, you see the expansion of the houses. By 2010, Ganeshpuri has reached essentially its maximum population capacity. It has about 1,200 people living within it. That's almost a standard deviation below the average size settlements in Jaipur. It will never be a big vote bank slum because of the constraints around the extent to which it can expand. And so, part of one of the final empirical chapter of the book is to sort of trace it back to the origins of what shapes the size and shape of these settlements. The second factor that drives variation in party network density is settlement diversity. So I had mentioned that there is this large literature in political economy that shows these associations, negative associations between ethnic diversity and cooperation. I find evidence for the exact opposite, that the more diverse India's slum settlements are in terms of caste, religion, region of origin, the more fragmented slum leadership becomes, and the more those settlements produce these dense party worker networks that are so advantageous for getting local public goods and services. So in the book, I seek to turn that sort of argument on its head and show that, in these settlements where collective action is so important to being able to get basic public goods and services, that being more diverse along those different axes is really a good thing. So just to quickly conclude, I hope the takeaways in my book are several things. First, I hope the book really shows that India's residents of India's urban slums have really substantial political agency. And much of the literature on urban low-income voters in India and elsewhere oftentimes grants them very little political agency. It renders them as sort of these constrained clients under the thumb of politicians. But what I hope to show in the book is that slum residents, they define and articulate their demands on the state from the bottom up. And they do so between the votes. They don't wait for elections to have things dangled in front of them by politicians. That they really engage in, what my co-author and friend Gabby Crooks-Wisner refers to as active forms of citizenship. They do everything from forming neighborhood associations. And for those of you that are familiar with the literature on urban politics, especially in South Asia, things like neighborhood associations are typically seen as something that middle-class neighborhoods do. But I find, the substantial evidence of associational life in slum settlements, everyday forms of claim making. Another fascinating feature of political agency that I find and I outline in the book is that, these slum leaders are not imposed on residents from above. The slum residents very frequently select their leaders, and they do so in a number of different ways. Sometimes this takes the form of community meetings that are highly deliberative, where residents discuss who is the best fit to lead us. In other instances, and what I outline in the book, some settlements create informal elections where they actually make sort of informal ballots and call the police and hold an election because multiple sort of slum leaders wanted to run, for the position of being their leader. So, this really shows that residents are absolutely pivotal in the construction of these political networks that connect them to the state. I also try to demonstrate and argue in the book, and I hope that this too is a contribution, that's in the large literature on distributed politics and political science. It's often assumed that in places like urban slums that house low-income voters, that these political brokers are just sort of omnipresent. They're everywhere and they're uniformly present across space. What I argue in the book is that we really need to look at the geography of brokerage, that these networks themselves of brokers are highly uneven across space, and that this really powerfully affects the mobilizational and claim-making capacity of neighborhoods. So really, a call to look into the geography of these networks themselves. I also hope that a contribution of the book is to show that informal accountability can be generated in these sort of vertical patron-client networks. A really influential study in this literature by Susan Stokes, coins this influential term, perverse accountability. That in political systems like India, it's not that voters hold politicians accountable; it's that politicians hold voters accountable for how they voted, and the carrot or stick is whether or not you get a public good or service. I hope that my book sort of demonstrates that bottom up accountability can emerge in these sort of patron-client systems. My book also highlights a pathway through which ethnic diversity can be positively related to public goods provision. And then finally, and I think I'll slightly bracket this one because I anticipate that Susan will ask me about it, but I think there are a number of policy implications of the book, particularly for this new wave of development thinking on community-driven developments, the importance of harnessing the participation of these communities. My book, I hope, really shows that India's slum leaders are sticky in terms of their legitimacy, in terms of the activities that they do within settlements, and that's many of these new urban development programs in India that I'm happy to talk about more, often explicitly call to circumvent these actors. These neighborhoods are still supposed to create these apolitical CBOs, community-based organizations, and work around the existing sets of informal leaders that operate within them. And what I argue, in the conclusion of the book is that not only is it unlikely that you can circumvent these actors, but that actually might be sort of foolhardy, that working with them in many instances could be a way of harnessing that community development that so many of these programs seek to do. So I'll stop there, but thank you all so much for hearing the presentation, and I really look forward to the questions and comments.
All right, so this is how we're going to run things. I am going to ask you one question for the moment, and then I am going to turn it over to the several individuals who have written in questions. I'll give them the opportunity to ask it themselves. If they indicate to me that they do not want to ask it themselves, I will go ahead and do it. So my first question, as you sort of guessed, because we talked about this to some degree, my question is about policy. You present a really interesting argument about what is necessary for slum dwellers to get more resources. And I think we can all agree that slum dwellers throughout the world, India in particular, but elsewhere as well, do need more resources, perhaps especially now. As a faculty member in the Keough School, I have to put my policy hat on and ask how we might translate your findings into effective policy. It would, of course, be very challenging to foster ethnic diversity in slums. There are a whole host of ethical issues related to that. The same is true of increasing slum size. But is there anything that can be done to increase the density of party workers? That's my question.
Yeah, Susan, thank you so much for that question. It's an immensely important one, and it's one that I try to grapple with in the concluding chapter of the book. I try to point to a couple of different policy implications that I think emerge from the book. The first is that, having spent a lot of time in government offices watching these big urban development programs unfold during my fieldwork, so things like Jane and URM that I mentioned earlier, or a program called Rajiv Awasi Yojana, which sought to provide sort of housing and give basic services to slum dwellers in India. I oftentimes sort of would encounter these sort of rubrics or ways that either government officials or consultants would prioritize what settlements would get help first, that the resources for any of the sort of developments or resettlements only scratches the surface of the number of settlements in any one particular city. And so what I really, one of the things that I argue in the book is that this concept of political marginalization is a really important one to consider as well. That other sort of indices of, vulnerability are often quantified in trying to make these priorities. But what I hope my book illustrates is that, some settlements are just extremely politically marginalized in the sense that they do not have that connectivity to political parties. There's not that sort of grassroots level political organization that is likely to yield infrastructure and services over time itself. And so, thinking more about, ideas of political marginalization, I think is really, really important. Another policy implication that I think is important is that project that I just mentioned, Rajiv Awasi Yojana. If you read the handbook of Rajiv Awasi Yojana on community organization, as I mentioned earlier, it explicitly says that every slum settlements that we work with needs to create a community-based organization, and the members of that organization cannot have any formal or informal ties to political parties. And so, after an entire book where I'm, arguing that, these slum leaders and particularly those that have party positions are so important to everyday distributed politics and claim making in these communities, a call to circumvent them, was certain, something for me to grapple with. And, I think this effort to depoliticize these spaces, could be an error. That's, these programs that are centrally or state sponsored in India cities, they sort of come and go. And, if the National Sample Survey Organization's data says anything about this, a very small percentage of slum settlements across India actually benefit from any of these programs. And so, the politics of these spaces and the informal leadership that emerges in them are going to be there in the community long after that program is sort of out there. So I think it's really important in terms of the design and implementation of these projects to, really fully consider these informal leaders and the benefits and the weaknesses of working with them. One of the certain weaknesses that I'd be happy to talk more about is that, and I'm drawing here on a survey of 629 slum leaders that Tarak Tachel and I conducted. The vast majority of these actors are men. About 12% of our sample were female slum leaders who actually, drawing on my ethnographic fieldwork, were in many instances some of the most firebrand slum leaders, but they are dramatically underrepresented in sort of this world of slum leadership, and so that of course will have really important implications for being sensitive to the unique and specific vulnerabilities that women in these communities might face, and how women in some settlements develop in many cases their own sort of sets of social and political networks, as some my colleagues studying these communities have outlined in their own work. But I think those are sort of two sort of key takeaways. In terms of increasing, size, ethnic diversity, I think, a lot of the elements of my theoretical framework, I think, produce these divergences, but interestingly don't immediately lend themselves to manipulation, on their own. That these are really within the logic of distributive politics themselves. And I think a lot of the fixes are likely to come with trying to find ways of giving politicians incentives to do things that they otherwise don't want to do. One of which is to give these neighborhoods property rights. The politicians in India's cities are loath to give property rights to slum settlements. They'll give them piped water sometimes, they'll pave roads, they'll dig drains, but if once you give them a land title, they're afraid that that's going to snap the dependency relationship, and then suddenly people in that community aren't going to go out and vote anymore. And so there's this really sort of horrible equilibrium where through the types of politics that I highlight in my book, neighborhoods can get things, but the real thing that many residents want is security over their land, and that's the most difficult thing to come by.
Thank you for that. We have only a tiny bit of time left, but we do have 4 different individuals who have questions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them to do the questions in a row so that perhaps if there are sort of efficiencies there in terms of how you answer them, maybe we can bring those out. So I hope you have a pen or something. Okay, so I first wanted to turn to Shanna Scoggin, and then to Erin McDonald, then to Susan Shepler, and then to Nikhil Menon.
Thanks. Thank you for this talk. It's so great. I haven't read the book yet, but we actually read your dissertation in Jamie Bleck's class and field research class. So sets the bar pretty high. My question was actually similar to Susan's. So I work in Nepal, but so I'm coming at it from a little bit different. But I wonder if you saw anything that actually led to variation in the party density. So, like what actually led to that variation. And related to that, I love this bottom-up accountability. It seems like there was none of that in the slums, but can you think of any other like mechanisms by which there might be that party, that bottom-up accountability, if not through this broker? And then a final one, if you had time, I wonder if you could just speak about your research now with COVID, but that's just because I'm a graduate student. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for those questions, and exciting to see you, Shana. To start on that first question, so the quantitative sort of analysis of what drives variation party networks really did center on population and ethnic diversity. And then the book seeks to lean on my qualitative fieldwork to really unpack those mechanisms themselves. That the more diverse the communities were, the more fragmented informal leadership tended to be, especially in the initial stages of the settlement's history. This created simply more nodes per capita of informal leadership. But over time, and I think this is an interesting sort of sociological process, the importance that people place on caste or religion or region of origin in shaping who they turn to for help relaxes over time as they interact with other people in the community. So there's this interesting path dependence to the fragmentation of leadership and the creation of these nodes. Then there's simply more people there that take on this title of slum leader that want one of those formal party positions, that wants to be part of these hierarchies. So it creates these denser networks, in those areas that are more diverse, that I ultimately argue is advantageous for securing public goods and services. And again, the other one being, population. That's something that's really out of the control of residents. Never once in several years of fieldwork, did I hear somebody say, when I first came to Jaipur, I first came to Bhopal, I was looking for a settlement that was going to be really big, because then that would be a bigger vote bank and we'd be able to get more stuff from it. I try to unpack the migration process and get into the decisions that people face when I moved to this new city of 3 million people. In Jaipur, for instance, there's about 300 slum settlements. In Bhopal, there's over 400. One of the big questions that I try to answer in one of the chapters of my book is, why do people decide to go where they do? What produces this ethnic diversity? And it's very clear that people don't have the capacity or to shop around. And this is in part what creates this ethnic diversity. That's, somebody has a friend or a cousin that happens to live in slum settlement A that can help them get housing and help find a job. And so they go there, and they don't know that, I'm coming from West Bengal, but there's Punjabis there, and there's, Rajasthanis and Gujaratis, and, there's all these different caste groups. In terms of fractionalization, the average settlements, the fractionalization score. So this represents, if you randomly selected 2 people from the neighborhood, what is the probability they would be of a different caste? The fractionalization score was 0.8, so an 80% chance in the average settlement that they're a different caste. For religion, it was just under 0.2, which is also quite high, especially given that both Jaipur and Bhopal, the 2 cities that I focus on, faced really serious Hindu-Muslim riots in the early 1990s. And there was sort of considerable segregation across the city of the 2 religious groups. But yeah, so population and diversity really sort of form those 2 key explanations of what drives variation in the networks to begin with. The sort of the origin story of them. Sorry, the light went off again. Yeah, just to quickly mention. So in some of my more current work with Pariy, we had surveyed these 629 slum leaders to ask a variety of questions sort of about their political lives. And these culminated in 2 papers that Susan mentioned earlier in APSR and AJPS. But what we did is, over the summer when and during the pandemic, particularly in April and May, there was a lot of these new sort of journal articles on, slum settlements are going to be the big hotspots where COVID spreads. That these are densely populated areas with very little in the way of sanitation and access to clean running water. That these are, really, COVID sitting duck hotspots. But we got somewhat frustrated with reading, continually reading these accounts, because it basically it basically organizationally flattened these neighborhoods. That there's no capacity within these neighborhoods to do anything at all. That they're just sort of lying in wait for the virus to get there. And so, and as I mentioned earlier, the lion's share of the work was of this work was being done on Mumbai. So we wanted to, this was the initial sort of impetus of like, we want to study this. So we returned to our survey of 629 slum leaders, and we had all of their phone numbers. And so we were able to contact about half of them to get a sense of, these people, these slum leaders are so important to everyday distributive politics in these communities. What are they doing during the pandemic? And what we find, and this is a paper that, hopefully it's an R&R right now for a special issue on COVID and development. So hopefully I'll be able to sort of, share it soon. But what we find is that slum leaders are still extremely active even during the pandemic and during India's lockdown, which was considered to be one of the most stringent lockdowns on earth. That they were continuing to be the main interface between everyday residents and local politicians, but that they've systematically shifted away from doing what they usually do, demanding public goods and services, to getting really basic government relief, particularly food. That's, they're living in neighborhoods where the vast majority of people live in the informal sector and depend on very precarious day-to-day wages. And so, economic distress in these neighborhoods is just immensely acute right now. And so the main sort of task that the slum leaders have been engaging in our sample have been to demand government relief. But we look at, differences across leaders in the reported responsiveness of the governments. And one of the things that clearly comes out is, are they embedded in these political networks that I highlight in my book? That this is even fragmenting government service or government relief during the context of the pandemic. But yeah, just to sort of give you a sense of what we're doing with that right now. But thank you so much for this question, Shanna.
All right, we are running down on time. So I want to ask if Nikhil and Susan could briefly ask your questions, one right after the other. And then Adam, you can have the final say. Erin McDonald had to leave, but she will reach out to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. I just want to quickly just say I'm a historian of 20th century India. And I was your remark about the stickiness of these slum leaders as power brokers reminded me of the work of Rajanayan Chandavarkar on colonial Mumbai. In case you haven't, checked that out, I think that's the role of the jobber seems very similar to that of the slum leader in today's India. And the question was, what is the role of ideology in choosing these juggi netas or these local netas or who becomes these sort of Dada-like figures, in that the vision you present is one of it working very efficiently. The best get the most number of followers? Are you able to petition the higher ups in the BJP or the INC the best and therefore get the most resources? What is the role of ideology, political partisanship in this, in getting these positions? And are they then at the mercy of changes at state level politics or municipal politics, right? So if you are a powerful slum leader, but then the municipal election goes the other way, what happens to your support if you're a BJP supporter and the Congress wins power? That's it. Thank you.
Super quick. Adam, you know I'm a big fan of this work. And I especially love the research design, for those of us who teach research design. I like the focus on holding the state accountable through politics, but I'm wondering if there are other people that slum residents turn to solve problems other than politicians. So do they turn to religious leaders, NGOs, private sector, or is it only political leaders? Thank you.
Really awesome set of questions. So thank you so much, Nikhil and Susan. Nikhil, to touch on some of your really fascinating questions. First, in terms of ideology, among the slum leaders, the BJP party workers in my sample articulated an ideological reason why they went into the BJP network, much more than the Congress party workers. So many of the BJP workers, for those of you that are familiar with Indian politics, were in the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is a Hindu nationalist, right-wing, enormous social organization with shakas or branches across India. So many of the BJP workers were very ideologically motivated, and there's less party switching among those that started off in the BJP too, likely because of that reason. But I do find, in terms of leadership selection, in these moments of selection, like community elections or just the everyday decisions that residents make over who will I turn to seek help and to follow, that it was largely driven by these sort of pragmatic, who can get me this thing? And I think that's especially intense in these neighborhoods that face so much material deprivation, that where there's an absence of so many very basic public goods and services. And I think this is also sort of manifests, again, drawing on some of the more current work I've been doing with Tariq, we find robust, evidence that, Hindu residents have no problem turning to Muslim slum leaders. Muslim slum leaders have no problem turning to Hindu slum leaders. People of different castes turning to one another. And we think, much of the underlying drivers of this is, the compulsions of getting things in areas that face such deprivation. In terms of changing politics at different levels of India, one of the interesting things that, at least in Jaipur and Bhopal, and I'm assuming in much of India, it's very common for the following scenario to be present. Your ward councillor is BJP. The municipal corporation is in the control of the Congress party. The states, your MLA is BJP. The state's in control in the Congress, and your MP is this party. Then, of course, the center is BJP. Very rarely, very, very rarely, is there total alignment from top to bottom, not only in terms of the governments, but the specific representatives. So I think this is another reason why, even though settlements that had party workers of only of one party can still get a lot of stuff, is that in the multifocal sort of constellation of political actors that they could potentially turn to, there almost always is somebody of their party. Another thing that I find sort of fascinating is that ex-elected representatives, so people that had won and were incumbents but then lost, they continue to do a ton of problem solving for people even after they lose office. I think, at least within political science, we're obsessed sometimes with incumbency and connectivity to the incumbents. But it was very clear to me that elected politicians had built and fostered relationships with bureaucrats. They're likely to want to run again. And they can still be turned to get leverage over the bureaucracy to get stuff. And so, even if you are out of, allies in terms of partisanship, there's still an even wider net of actors that you could turn to get help, which I think is a nice segue to Susan's question. One of the consequences, I think, of not going to a place like Mumbai or Bangalore and going to places like Jaipur and Bhopal that are still quite large, very large cities comparatively, the NGO scene is very, very thin. There's very little NGO activity in these communities, and to the extent that they are, it's very fleeting. And not to dismiss this, but it will be sort of very bounded interventions around, doing a training program or something like that. So NGOs, interestingly, were really conspicuously absent from this world of mediation between residents and the larger political currents of the city. There were some Hindu nationalist organizations that were around, things like Seva Bharti. So the BJP and the Hindu nationalist organizations in India have a number of social service wings that do things like set up small schools, or they'll set up eye camps and do cataract surgery, these sorts of things. There was some of that, but overwhelmingly, the main, as Anirudh Krishna calls, institution in the middle are the political parties, which is quite interesting, I think, for those of us that study India, because parties in India are conventionally seen as quite weak and fleeting. But a lot of that stems from, most studies have been on rural India, where that is still seemingly largely the case. But in India's cities, these machine politics, I think, are becoming much more important. And then just to return to Nikhil's his first point, I think one of my favorite things about this project, looking back, since being a Kellogg fellow, is that studying these urban spaces, political science for some reason has been way behind or late to the party on comparatively studying urban spaces, and I don't know why that is. But I think most of the very best work on these sort of subjects are done in anthropology, geography, in particular, sociology, but more sort of in the U.S. context, and historians looking at the colonial period and the production of urban space and urban informality in the colonial period. And so I've been so lucky and have tried to allocate a lot of time, and I hope this is reflected in the book, in really drawing on a multidisciplinary set of literatures to try to understand why some of these communities are simply succeeding more than others in getting access to services. And I found most of the most helpful studies, and most of my bookshelf back there is actually, I feel like a traitor to my discipline, but they're actually not from political science at all. They're from anthropology and geography, and some on history as well, which I really felt like I needed to get into in doing this historical process tracing of the microhistories of these communities. So that's been one of the more interesting aspects of the book writing process for me.
All right, I will go ahead and thank you, Adam, for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure. We're so sorry that you couldn't actually come to campus. We'll have you back to campus at some point in the future, I hope. I also want to thank everybody who was in attendance.